Ian Murray.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I just pay tribute to the member for East Renfrewshire for the contribution that he has just made. I think he, in his sensible way that he's taken this bill on board, shows that across the benches we can't just get to a consensus on some of these issues, but we can make this legislation better. And that is why we are here. And the dogma in which the government have approached the withdrawal of the UK from the European Union, and indeed this bill, will, in many instances, shape the way that the United Kingdom operates for generations to come. And I wish there was more of the member's attitudes, like the member from East Renfrewshire, to be able to take some of this bill through. But I do say very gently to him that he's looking for assurances on Amendment 164 and 165, amendments in my name. The best way for him to get assurances would be for him and his colleagues to wander down the lobby with us tonight and put them on the face of the bill. And that way he would get the assurance that it was on the bill already, and the Government and the Treasury bench would get the message that these clauses, Clause 11, as currently constituted, is indeed incorrect. Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise to move Amendment 164, 165, 177, 178, 179, 180, 181, 189, 190, 191, 158, 192, 193, 194, 195, 161, all in my name, appreciating that many of these amendments are consequential on my main amendment 164 and 165, and many of the votes will be taken on a separate day. And can I also just say in opening that actually the Amendment 42, in the name of the front bench of my friends and right honourable friends, is indeed much better drafted than mine. I wish I'd said that 2 weeks ago in the Customs Union debate. And therefore, probably Amendment 42 is the one that would be carried, because it does include the issues with regards to Northern Ireland. That I missed off my amendment because of the constitutional difficulties in Northern Ireland. And may I just allow a few moments just to pay tribute to the former MP for Lanark and Hamilton East in this chamber, Jimmy Hood, who died last night. We send his wife Marion and his wider family all the very best of our thoughts and wishes in the days to come. Jimmy was a close friend of mine, a close friend of this House, and was a great source of advice and indeed fun, particularly in the tea room, Madam Deputy Speaker. And before telling you any stories about the former MP for Lanark and Hampton East in the tea room, I think we should perhaps move on to the amendments, because they may not be overly appropriate to this chamber. Can I also gently say to the Conservative members of this House, and I did this 2 weeks ago in the debate we had on the Ways and Means motion with regards to the discussions about the Customs Union, that we do in this House try our very best to represent our constituents, to represent the views of our constituents, of our wider geographical areas, indeed of our nations in terms of Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, England and the wider United Kingdom. But it is the case that the trumpeting of the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party in terms of winning 13 seats in Scotland at the election in 2017 was heralded as these 13 Scottish Conservative members of Parliament coming to this House to stand up and defend the interests of Scotland. And in terms of the context of this bill, the only Scottish Conservative member of Parliament to do that so far is a member for East Renfrewshire, and he's demonstrated that today and indeed in previous votes in this House. And one has to ask the question whether the Conservative members of Parliament from Scotland in this House are indeed here under the flag of the Conservative leader Ruth Davidson, or whether or not they're under the flag of the Whip's office of the UK Government. And I suspect it's the latter. I'm very happy to take an intervention when he answers the question about whether or not he's standing up for the interests of Scotland or standing up for the interests of his Chief Whip.
Thank you very much to the member for taking my intervention, and absolutely that is the case. That's why there's 13 of us here and 7 Scottish Labour there. And on that point, as you can see, there's a number of my colleagues sitting on the benches round about me here. You seem to be the sole Scottish Labour member here. I think the Scottish Conservatives are doing well for standing up for Scotland.
Well, I think the member has just demonstrated that he will be voting with the UK Government whips this evening against the wishes of the Scottish people and the will of the Scottish people in terms of the referendum. And when Ruth Davidson has always asked this question about the 13 Scottish Conservative MPs, she says they're there to fight the corner of Scotland. Well, it's quite clearly not. It's quite clearly not, because they are not going to fight the corner of Scotland and these particular clauses in this bill today. Can I just very briefly mention new clause 65 with regards to the Joint Ministerial Committee? I have long tried in this House to strengthen the case of the Joint Ministerial Committees. Indeed, it was part of the original Smith Commission. That was the result of the independence referendum in 2014. The Smith Commission was established on a cross-party basis, and one of the key aspects of the Smith Commission was to strengthen intergovernmental relationships so that these kinds of issues could not occur. I was disappointed when we tried in the Scotland Act of 2016, which we debated in this House in 2015, to propose amendments to strengthen that relationship, but they were rejected by government. And it seems that many of the conclusions that many of the commentators have had on this particular bill to date is that weak intergovernmental and inter-parliamentary working is causing some of the problems. And indeed, the Smith Commission did say in his final report from Lord Smith of Kelvin from the other place, it said, throughout the course of the Commission, this was back in 2014 of course, the issue of weak intergovernmental working was repeatedly raised as a problem. And that's been a common thread throughout many of the documents we've had. And indeed, I think the Public Accounts Commission that produced their report on this particular Clause 11 mentioned at great length how difficult it was and how impenetrable it was to even determine what the JMCs were discussing, what their final conclusions were, when they were meeting. They've been sporadic. And indeed, when you have a private committee that produces minutes which are very sparse, the politics take over, and it's always clear that the UK and Scottish governments, being different colours, blue and yellow, would never agree in the political sphere, and therefore the JMC becomes diluted to a political argument rather than what it's trying to achieve. And I intervened on my honourable friend from the front bench during her wonderful speech earlier to talk about what the JMC produces in terms of a minute. And the minute from the JMC in October merely it was 2 pages in length, with a page and a half telling us who attended and who provided apologies, with a very brief skeletal explanation of what they discussed, with no real conclusion. And I think the JMC really has to be put on a statutory footing with the parameters required to be able to be transparent to the public, but also to this House. And I think that's why new clause 65, in the name of my honourable friends, is something we should support and try and get some sense into the process of the joint ministerial committees. We're heading into a constitutional crisis. We have the Conservative Party threatening the very United Kingdom and the fabric of it, just after the people of Scotland decided that the UK should stay together. We have the farce of the events that we've seen today, where the Prime Minister and Downing Street have been spinning out that a deal is close to being done, where the Prime Minister is barely through her soup with Donald Tusk, and Downing Street start backtracking as quickly as possible on the briefings they're putting out that a deal is close. And then we have a phone call from the leader of the DUP, who controls the government, the real de facto Prime Minister in this country, to pull the rug from underneath the feet of the Prime Minister, who then turns her back on something that looks as though had already been negotiated and agreed. I'm happy to.
I'm very grateful. Is he also aware that the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, has said, "I am surprised and disappointed that the British government now appears not to be in a position to conclude what was agreed earlier today."
Order. The honourable gentleman might be making an interesting point, but it's not directly relevant to the new clause that we are discussing here right now. Mr Murray.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I just respond very briefly to say I'm surprised he's disappointed, but not surprised that he's surprised with regards to what the Taoiseach has said with regards to that.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and with very specific reference to the new amendments that have been tabled to this bill, particularly that importance of joint ministerial consultation around a whole series of matters. Does he wonder, like I do, whether or not, in fact, the First Minister of Wales, the First Minister of Scotland, indeed the Mayor of London, we've also heard speaking out, were in any way consulted on the terms that were potentially being offered in this negotiation in Brussels today?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and that's the point I'm making about the constitutional crisis we are currently in, because it seems to me that the only way to follow the discussions between the UK government and what's happening in the European Union is to follow Twitter. Journalists seem to know before people in this House know what is happening, and indeed we seem to get a running commentary from the government in terms of their press releases, but we get absolutely nothing through the devolved administrations in proper consultation. I want to give way to my honourable friend from the DUP, because I think he might have something interesting to say.
Well, I'm glad the member thinks of something interesting to say, as I know he always has something interesting to say, but specifically on new clause 64. I mean, in the general point, I don't think anyone should get their news constantly from Twitter. But on the key point, on all of these clauses, should we not show discernment and skill and make sure that we don't fall for the spin, whether it comes out of Dublin or London or Brussels? Let this negotiation run and let's see what comes out of it at the end.
I couldn't agree with the honourable gentleman more, but why don't we bring some of that to this House rather than the commentary on Twitter? It seems to me that the journalists who are currently following the Prime Minister seem to know much more that's going on than anybody in this House, and indeed if the Prime Minister wants to come off the flight, and government ministers are very quick at getting back from foreign countries, as we've demonstrated over the summer, and come to this House and let us know what's exactly going on, we wouldn't stand here and speculate about what's happening. But I would say to the honourable gentleman, and he mentioned it in an intervention earlier on in this House about regulatory harmonisation, and I think he let out the cat out of the bag when he mentioned that the DUP are firmly against that regulatory harmonisation in the island of Ireland, and that's why it's so important across the rest of the United Kingdom. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I wonder if my honourable friend noticed that, in fact, the Minister, who's apparently been briefing other members of the Conservative Party, has just appeared in the chamber. Perhaps he could give us some answers about what exactly has been going on in Brussels today.
No, he can't. We are discussing these clauses and amendments to this bill, not what people are seeing on Twitter. If the Prime Minister has anything to report to this House, I'm sure she will come at the earliest opportunity to give such a report. Mr Murray.
Grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. I do apologise to the House for digressing, but these are incredibly important matters and are actually directly connected to the amendments I've put forward, because it's about keeping the devolved administrations informed and having them as part of this particular process. And if what we're discussing in this chamber today is being dismissed, or the member for East Renfrewshire is seeking assurances, well, the demonstration of what we've seen since lunchtime today should give him cause for concern that no assurances are going to be forthcoming, and we have to put on the face of the bill the issues around what we require to see from this government to make sure the devolved administrations are properly informed, because it's not about the devolved administrations, it's about the people that they represent. I'll have to give way.
In a forgiving way, but does he not accept that his amendments would allow every single one of these 111 powers to be immediately devolved from day one with no constraints, therefore enabling all the devolved administrations to do whatever they wanted? So from day one we could have divergence. And he, as a gentleman himself who believes in continuity and maintaining similarities between the four components of the UK, so does he not understand why his amendments are dangerous to the integrity of the UK's internal market, because from day one the four component parts of the United Kingdom could go off and do whatever they wanted?
I want to answer that directly slightly later when I talk about the Law Society of Scotland's potential options that could have been. You could devolve everything and then have agreements put in place if the Joint Ministerial Committee worked properly, if intergovernmental relations worked properly. There are a number of other options. It's not just me that's saying that, but many of the organisations that's commented on the clauses in the bill. I'll go back to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the member for giving way. Could he give me some clarity with regards to the clause and the amendment that he's proposing? Is he suggesting, really, that parts of the United Kingdom should be treated differently to other parts of the United Kingdom? Should London have a different and better deal than, say, Cardiff, Edinburgh, Wales or Belfast? Or should we all not be treated the same as United Kingdom subject?
Well, actually, I agree that all parts of the United Kingdom should be treated similarly, and that's why I've always championed the UK staying in the single market and the customs union, because that would allow us to leave the European Union, but while keeping the regulatory harmonisation that's required, the very regulatory harmonisation that he railed against just a few moments ago, and keep the United Kingdom single market operating with the EU single market. I'll give way to the honourable lady.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. With regards to where the power actually lies, we know that many farmers voted leave, and yet when I attended an NFU meeting on Friday, the idea of farming in Scotland, hill farming in Scotland, being controlled from here is something they consider anathema. And for them, the failure to pass on the convergence uplift in 2013-14, they see exactly as something they're frightened about farming powers being here.
Well, I mean, these are always complicated and complex discussions and complicated issues that have to be dealt with. I think we're dealing with here a key principle. And the key principle should always be where a power is devolved, as it is under Schedule 5 of the Scotland Act of 1998, or omitted from Schedule 5 of the Scotland Act 1998, and therefore the principle should be that that should be devolved. Nobody is saying that everything should just be devolved at 1 minute past midnight, or whenever it is we leave the European Union. But these discussions have to happen through intergovernmental processes, and the principle should be that they are devolved at the point in which they come back from the European Union, where it's possible to do so.
We're getting nice and generous. But would you accept that if the powers are devolved without a framework, first of all, being established, then whether you talk about a European single market or a UK single market, that principle could not be applied, because 4 different administrations would have powers devolved to them, could then make whatever regulations they wanted. How does he then marry that up with the need, the recognised need that he has pointed out, of having a UK single market? Surely that's where the framework should be set first of all, and then the remaining powers devolved to assemblies.
Well, but that assumes that you automatically start from a position of hoarding the powers here at Westminster, and I disagree with that principle. The principle has to be that where a power is currently devolved to the devolved administrations, that power should be devolved. It's a fairly simple principle. You might not agree with the principle, I accept that, but it is a fairly sensible principle. And I'll come to you in one second. My amendment merely removes from section 29(2)(d) of the Scotland Act of 1998 under legislative competence the words EU law, so that everything else would have to be compatible as with the Scotland Act. I'll give way to my neighbour from Northleaf.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. He mentions the hoarding of powers from Westminster. One of the biggest problems, as far as I can see, with the clause is this, that ultimately Scottish ministers will be unable to amend retained EU law for potentially an indefinite period, while UK ministers will, and that seems to me to be completely against the word and the spirit of the devolution settlement. Would the honourable member agree?
Well, it is against the spirit of the devolution settlement, but also it's against the spirit of the referenda that we'd heard about earlier. It was the Scottish people, the Welsh people, the Northern Irish people, the Irish people who voted for devolution, and that's what they've voted for. And there's no doubt that Clause 11 is using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. There's so many other ways that could be put in place in legislation that would allow a transition at day one that would respect the devolution settlement, and the Law Society have put forward those options. And as the leader of the SNP said earlier, it's quite clear that the government are using Clause 11 without a sunset clause. There is no timetable attached. There is no list of powers attached and when certain powers will be given priority. There is no commitment to intergovernmental working. There's no real commitment to devolution. And the reason that we got diverted to the discussions today that are happening in Brussels was because that is all part of the disrespect to the devolution settlement in this country, and why it's become so difficult. I'll give way to.
Does he also acknowledge the disrespect that the Taoiseach has shown to the people of Northern Ireland today, whenever he said that he now speaks for the people of Northern Ireland and the DUP and other elected parties don't? Is it not time that he knows exactly that the power for Northern Ireland, for democracy, for the political process is here in this chamber, and certainly doesn't lie with Leo Varadkar as a Taoiseach of the Republic of Ireland?
Well, I think perhaps we're being diverted off the point again, but I think for the chamber and the country, or anybody who happens to be watching these proceedings, will see that the 3 members of the Democratic Unionist Party that are sitting in this chamber are the real government in this House. They are dictating the terms of Brexit. The member who's just intervened to me, the honourable gentleman, is no doubt the de facto Secretary of State for exiting the European Union in terms of the power that they have over the Prime Minister, because it's clear, as I said earlier, that between courses at lunch this afternoon, the Prime Minister has gone from a negotiated agreement to a set of texts to throwing it in the bin alongside any leftovers from the lunch. And it's clear that the Democratic Unionist Party, 10 members of Parliament from Northern Ireland, are holding this government to account, are holding this government round the neck, because it's much more important for the Prime Minister to hold on to power than it is to do what's in the best interests of all of our nations. I'm happy to give way.
I would thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. I would just very gently point out to him, at least there are 3 DUP members of Parliament in the chamber. There are, on my count, only 2 Scottish Labour MPs. And I've just put to him this concern I have, which is he talks a very good game for defending the Union. He talks a very good game for defending the Union, but the reality is the leader of the SNP in Scotland, Mrs Sturgeon, and the Mayor of London have been very quick to start talking about how they would like to have divergence, special deals, which would be a complete wrecking of the Union of the United Kingdom.
Well, I normally say I'm grateful for interventions, but in this particular instance I will refrain. And I don't see what relevance it is of how many members of how many parties are in the chamber at any particular time. It's about making sure that the members are in the lobby later tonight, and I hope that 13 of the Scottish Conservative colleagues are in the lobby with us this evening to change this bill, because that's what's important when we get to this bill. It's about voting, it's not about talking and then doing nothing. I'm happy to give way.
Very good speech, but he isn't actually giving a speech in support of his own amendments. He's giving a speech in support of a middle ground between the UK and Scottish Government positions. Does he not understand, again, that his amendment will devolve everything from day one with no constraints, thereby enabling all 4 constituent parts of the UK to do whatever they want? If that is not the Labour position, it's bonkers.
Well, it's quite funny he now calls my position bonkers when he was looking for assurances that Amendment 164 and 165 that are in my name would be carried by the Government in order to make sure that that Clause 11 was a much more appropriate clause to have in this bill. And if he wants to intervene again and tell us exactly what he meant, because I'm confused about now what he seems to want to support my amendments, not support my amendments, seek assurances, vote with the Government, back Ruth Davidson. I'm not quite sure where he stands.
Just give him again, but he doesn't seem to have actually read his own amendment. I am not suggesting, I do not want either Clause 11 as it stands or Clause 11 as suggested by the Scottish and Welsh governments, because both go too far. They need a middle ground, and that needs to be dealt with by knowing what the position is going to be on powers. We don't seem to have too far between us, but he is voting for something that he is not arguing for.
Well, without being disrespectful to the honourable gentleman, because I know he's new to this place, only being elected in June 2017, but he could have brought his own amendment to do this. Where is it? He has the cheek to stand in this chamber and criticise my amendments, to say that he wants to seek assurances from his own government, but doesn't have the gall to put his own amendment up to seek what he wants to seek. And that just highlights one thing, Mr Chair, in this particular debate. The Scottish Conservative Party are happy to bluff and bluster in this chamber, straight from the Alex Salmond playbook, but when it comes to putting their money where their mouth is, they will walk down the lobby with the Government in order to not deliver what they actually fundamentally believe what they want to actually deliver. So I look forward in report stage to the honourable gentleman coming forward with a raft of amendments that make sure Clause 11 is changed into a much better clause. I look forward to him being influential with his front bench to be able to make sure that that is indeed carried by this House. Happy to give way.
I'm honourable friend for giving way. Turning to the whole group of amendments that he's referring to, is it not the case that the reason why he, myself, indeed a number of parties across the House have had to work together to put these down with the support of the Welsh and Scottish governments is that, in fact, this bill is deficient in so many areas, and it needs to be fixed in many areas before we can even consider it going forward, and before the Welsh and Scottish legislatures certainly will give their consent.
Absolutely, and I think it comes down to the word trust. And many of the reports that we've had on this bill comes down to whether or not the devolved administrations trust the UK government to deliver what they are attempting to seek to deliver in this bill. And I don't think we can trust them to do that. And indeed, the Law Society of Scotland argued that the bill should be revised because there is no transitional basis with regards to Clause 11. This is an open-ended clause that could last forever. And again, as we've seen, we could have government ministers in Cardiff, in Edinburgh, in Belfast and indeed in Whitehall arguing about the minutiae of detail rather than actually getting on with the job in hand for political purposes, because that would be what they would be trying to determine on. And we've seen on every single aspect of devolution in this House that when it comes down to the politics of it, it's the people that lose out and the politics that try to win out. And that's something that we should be very wary of with regards to this bill.
I thank him for giving way again. It's been very, very generous. And does he not agree with me that that is because of the example that has been set on so many issues? Look at the issue of the Agricultural Workers Board, for example. We do not want to see case after case after case ending up in the Supreme Court with vast amounts of taxpayers' money being spent, with the UK government fighting the devolved governments over matters where they have the clear competence.
Absolutely, and then you get into that constitutional battle with no end in sight. The Institute for Government, that I'm sure all sides of this chamber respect, said that this bill has exacerbated the already serious tensions between the UK and the devolved governments. Well, we see that day after day. The Repeal Bill Alliance concluded that by returning all EU power to Westminster against the wishes of Scotland and Wales, the EU Withdrawal Bill is an attack on the principles of devolution. So these are, time and time again, committees of this House, independent bodies, respected bodies telling us that this bill is indeed deficient, is a power grab on the government, and indeed could be done in a different way. In fact, one of the conclusions, Mr Chair, of the Public Affairs Committee report that they produced with regards to Clause 11 concluded that the overall concerns regarding the devolution aspect of this bill arise from the constitutionally insensitive nature of the UK government's approach. The constitutionally insensitive nature of the UK government's approach. And what we're trying to do, or what I'm trying to do with these amendments, is to take away some of that constitutional insensitivity to be able to get to a place where we can be much more comfortable that the government will do what they said they would do. The Brexit Select Committee, and indeed the well-respected Right Honourable Gentleman, the Chair of the Select Committee, their report also looked at this bill with regards to the devolved administrations, and they concluded that devolved administrations have insufficient trust in the process for agreeing future relations and have accordingly indicated that they would hold the legislative consent from this bill. Now, that's an incredibly serious issue, because the Scotland Act of 2016 put the Sewell Convention on a legislative footing that means that the UK government should not be legislating in devolved areas unless the Scottish Parliament, or indeed any of the other devolved administrations, pass a legislative consent motion. They are saying that they will withhold a legislative consent motion as this bill is currently constituted, and that means we end up in yet another constitutional difficulty with regards to whether or not we will even see this bill passed. What will the UK government do? They will ride roughshod over the constitutional settlement, ride roughshod over the Sewell Convention, ride roughshod over the Scotland Act of 2016, where the Sewell Convention was put on the statutory footing, in order to get through a bill that, if they just worked cross-party on Clause 11, and indeed with some of their own members from the Scottish Conservatives, they may get to a place that we could all support and all respect. If I may just go on to some of the alternative solutions that the Law Society of Scotland put forward. I think it's worth working through these, particularly for the member for East Renfrewshire, who's desperate to find an alternative to this clause. They've put forward some solutions. They, I should say, are not, Mr Crosbie, saying anyone takes preference over the other, but they are just giving some of the indications of different ways that this could be done to make it less constitutionally insensitive. They said you could repeal the EU law constraint and amend Schedule 5 of the 1998 Scotland Act to re-reserve specific competencies to the UK level to enable the UK government to establish common frameworks. That would essentially allow us to devolve the vast majority of the competencies coming back from the European Union, and with agreement reserve some of the more complicated issues that may be required to do so. I think agriculture from the Honourable Lady was one that she mentioned before. They could replace the cross-cutting EU constraint with new cross-cutting constraints, for example, to protect the UK single market and or to comply with international obligations. These might be more or less extensive than the EU law constraint that's in practice already, but would have the benefit of A, an underpinning principle, and catering for unseen cases. That's the second alternative solution put forward by the Law Society. I'm not advocating any one of these either. I just think it's worth airing there are alternatives to Clause 11 in this bill. They could repeal the EU law constraint, leaving EU competences to fall as determined by Schedule 5 of the Scotland Act of 1998, and any new common frameworks to be established by agreement between the UK government and the devolved administrations. And that's the answer directly to the Honourable Gentleman for East Renfrewshire, that you could devolve everything but come to an agreement with regards to some of the UK-type frameworks and common frameworks that may be required. Alternatively, you could adopt the provisions in the bill on a transitional basis only and subject to a specific cut-off date. At the expiry of the transition period, powers in devolved areas would revert to the devolved legislators unless specific alternatives have been put in place. And indeed you can see from the 4 alternative solutions from the Law Society of Scotland that you could mix and match from various of these solutions. But it goes back to the fundamental principle of trust, and goes back to the fundamental principle of whether or not the UK Government and the devolved administrations are truly working together to seek a solution, or whether or not the politics of this trumps the solutions that may be required. And that's why I think that the front bench new clause with regards to the Joint Ministerial Committees is something that we should pass. Mr Crosbie, I propose these amendments to try and take the edge off this bill. We are heading into a constitutional crisis. The Conservative Party have left this country out of the EU and risking the constitutional framework of the UK. And it's quite clear that the question that cannot be answered from this government, which is the same question, I have to say, that the members of the Scottish National Party cannot answer, but in reverse. How is the EU single market so important? And I believe it is. And the customs union, and I think we see the issues with regards to the island of Ireland. Why is that so important but the UK single market is not? And likewise, I say to the Conservative Party, how can they stand on a platform in 2014 in the Scottish referendum and say that removing Scotland from the UK single market will mean a hard border, will mean customs checks, will mean that there will be no movement of people from Scotland into England, and defend that principle, but do completely the opposite when it comes to the island of Ireland now? You can't have the single market customs union principles on one hand and then discard them on the other because it suits your political ideology. It's quite clear that a frictionless, seamless border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, while not staying in the single market or the customs union, is utterly impossible to achieve. And the reason it's utterly impossible to achieve is because I was persuaded by the arguments that the UK Government made back in 2014 that removing Scotland from the single market of the United Kingdom would require a hard border at Berwick. Have to go.
I'm just concerned to clarify something. He keeps referring to the single market of the United Kingdom. Will you agree with me that what we have in the United Kingdom is a unitary market? Because we don't have 4 separate states, we have a union of 4 separate nations. What the EU has is a single market. A single market is a regulatory alignment of sovereign states. We don't have that in the UK. It's a unitary market. And will he use his language more carefully, please?
Well, it's legal semantics. I mean, I can buy an animal in Edinburgh and sell it in London, crossing the border with it in the back of my car. Not that I would do so, Mr Crosbie, because that would probably be illegal. But just to highlight the point, in one single market, pay for it. And not have any customs checks, not have any transfer of paperwork apart from the legal paperwork required, and I can do that across the European Union. The point I'm trying to make, outside the legal semantics, is that we have the Scottish National Party saying that the EU single market is a good thing, and I agree, but saying the UK single or unitary market is a bad thing, and I disagree. We have the Conservative Party saying that the UK single market is the most wonderful single market in the world, and I agree, but they're also saying that the EU single market is a bad thing and we must come out of the EU single market, but we can keep all the benefits of that at the same time.
Generous. He's being generous in giving way. The crucial difference is this. The crucial difference between the single market and the unitary market is in the single market, at the moment, there are 28 sovereign states who meet together to make their rules from the top down. In the UK market, it's a unitary market where the rules are imposed from the United Kingdom. Now, this actually supports the argument the honourable member is making, because the argument the honourable member is making, which I agree with, is that these frameworks across the UK shouldn't be imposed from the top down, but should grow up organically from the bottom.
Well, I think we've just had a bombshell there, Mr Crosbie, haven't we? Because we have the member from Edinburgh South West telling us that she wants to stay part of the United Kingdom. I think was what you could surmise from that particular intervention. I completely agree with her that the best way for Scotland to thrive and for Wales to thrive is to stay part of the United Kingdom. And indeed, in my view, the best best way for the United Kingdom to thrive would be to stay part of the single market and the customs union of the European Union, and all of these particular issues would therefore fall away, because you would not need Clause 11, because you would not need the framework in place to be able to put UK frameworks together, because you could stay within the frameworks that are already in place. And it seems strange to me that we will spend a significant amount of time in this chamber, a significant amount of time in the committee rooms of this House, a significant amount of time in all the devolved administrations, discussing frameworks that we already currently have. And it seems to me that the government strategy they want every benefit that they currently have from the European Union whilst not being a member of the European Union. I would suggest perhaps that if the government want to achieve that, then it would be best to stay in rather than wrench themselves out, and that would resolve all the problems, and indeed it would have saved the Prime Minister lunch this afternoon, because they would have had a very straightforward solution to their problem. Mr Crosbie, I will move my amendment. I will say at the end of my remarks that I won't push my amendment to the vote if the front bench are pushing their Amendment 42, because it's very similar in nature, and the front bench amendment is much more technically efficient than my amendment perhaps was, and we know that when I have technically ineffective amendments in this place, they tend to be criticised. So I will support the amendment of the front bench and merely say that the simple solution to Northern Ireland, the simple solution to Scotland, the simple solution to Wales would be to stay in the single market and the customs union, and I therefore move my amendment.